Case 1. Erika and Benjamin Sifrit. The bathroom door splintered under the weight of the first shot. Joshua Ford pressed his back against the tile wall, heart hammering, knowing that the couple who'd bought them drinks 2 hours ago was now hunting them room by room. Beside him, Marty Crutchley gripped his arm, her breathing shallow and fast. The flimsy lock on that bathroom door was the only thing standing between them and whatever had turned a fun vacation night into a waking nightmare. Outside, footsteps, a voice, calm, almost playful. Then another shot tore through the wood. Rewind 3 hours. Memorial Day weekend 2002. Ocean City, Maryland is doing what it does best, selling escape. Neon lights bounce off the bay. Drunk laughter spills from every doorway, and the air hangs heavy with salt, spilled beer, and the grease from boardwalk fries. For Josh and Marty, a professional couple from Virginia, this was supposed to be a break from the grind. A few days of sun, drinks, and anonymity in a beach town that never sleeps. They weren't the only ones looking to blow off steam. Erika and Benjamin Sifrit were in town too. On paper, they were the kind of couple small towns brag about. Ben had been a Navy SEAL, trained, disciplined, dangerous in all the right ways. Erika had been a college basketball standout, fierce and magnetic. Together, they ran a scrapbooking business and looked like they'd stepped out of a suburban dream. But beneath that polished surface, something had curdled. Friends would later describe Erika as controlling, possessive, and cold. Ben was volatile, eager to prove himself, hungry for adrenaline. They collected guns. They displayed Nazi memorabilia, and they liked testing boundaries just to see how far they could push. The two couples crossed paths on a shuttle bus headed to Secrets, the sprawling waterfront nightclub that's the beating heart of Ocean City nightlife. Josh and Marty realized they didn't have exact change for the fare. The Sifrits offered to cover them in exchange for a drink later. It was the kind of small, forgettable favor strangers do for each other on vacation. No big deal. Inside Secrets, the night unfolded like 1,000 others. Drinks flowed, stories were traded, laughter came easy. By the time the lights came up and the crowd thinned, the four of them had slipped into that easy, anonymous intimacy that only happens on holiday. When Erika and Ben invited Josh and Marty up to their penthouse condo on 112th Street to keep the party going, it sounded harmless. Why not finish the night with an ocean view? But once the door to that rainbow condominium penthouse closed, the energy shifted. Erika suddenly claimed her purse was missing. Her tone sharpened. She accused Josh and Marty of stealing it. At first, it might have felt like a bad joke or a drunken misunderstanding. Then it escalated. This wasn't confusion, this was a setup. The missing purse was a device, an excuse to flip the script from hospitality to terror. A gun appeared. The friendly couple from the shuttle became predators. Josh and Marty, now suspects in an imagined theft, were trapped in a stranger's condo at 2 a.m. with a weapon pointed at them. That's when they locked themselves in the bathroom, and that's when the Sifrits started shooting. By the early hours of May 26, 2002, both Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley were dead. What followed revealed a level of cruelty that stunned even hardened investigators. The Sifrits dismembered the bodies. They packed the remains into trash bags, loaded them into their car, and drove to Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, where they dumped everything into commercial dumpsters behind a Food Lion. Weeks later, police would search a nearby landfill and recover only fragments. Ford's torso, part of Crutchley's leg. The rest was gone, swallowed by the machinery of waste disposal. And then the Sifrits did what psychopaths do best. They acted normal. They went outlet shopping. They grabbed food. Erika wore jewelry that would later be identified as belonging to the victims. Back in Virginia, Josh and Marty's family started to panic. Calls went unanswered. They didn't show up for work. Missing persons reports were filed. The break came from a different crime entirely. On May 31st, less than a week after the murders, Erika and Ben were caught trying to burglarize a Hooters restaurant in Ocean City. When police arrested Erika and searched her purse, they found something that turned a petty burglary into a homicide investigation: the driver's licenses of Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. Under interrogation, Erika cracked first. She admitted the couple had been at their condo but tried to paint herself as a terrified bystander, and Ben as the primary killer. Ben stayed mostly silent. Investigators concluded that both had participated, each feeding off the other's worst impulses. Because of the media frenzy, the trials were moved out of Worcester County. Ben's case went to Rockville, Erika's to Frederick. The verdicts reflected how differently juries saw their roles. Ben was convicted of second-degree murder and first-degree assault in Crutchley's death, but acquitted in Ford's case. He got 38 years. Erika was convicted of first-degree murder in Joshua Ford's killing and second-degree murder in Crutchley's. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years. A judge called them butchers. Both remain incarcerated, denied parole at every turn. Ocean City still sells the same dream, but some tourists never check out. You just heard about a couple who turned a vacation into a torture chamber. That was just the beginning. Maryland, land of colonial charm, blue crabs, and the Chesapeake, has a darker resume. Over the next several minutes, you're going to hear about 10 cases so twisted, so unexpectedly brutal, that they've become the stories people in this state whisper about but never forget. We're talking snipers who paralyzed an entire region, a gardener who buried children under the flower beds, a teenage honor student who executed his whole family in their sleep. These aren't Hollywood scripts. These are real people, real crimes, real consequences, and every single one of them happened here. Before we go deeper, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Case 2. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. October 2002, the DC suburbs are settling into fall. Parents are thinking about Halloween costumes. Commuters are adjusting to shorter days and longer rush hours. Coffee runs, grocery store trips, school drop-offs. Ordinary American life humming along at its usual pace. Then over the course of 3 weeks, that ordinary life fractures under the weight of an invisible threat. The first sign comes on October 2nd, 2002 in Wheaton, Maryland. A man crossing a parking lot collapses, a single rifle shot from an unknown location. He's dead before anyone realizes what happened. Within 24 hours, 5 more people in Montgomery County are shot in seemingly unconnected public spaces. A gas station, a supermarket parking lot, a commuter bus stop. All of them going about mundane, forgettable tasks. All of them taken down by a single high-velocity round fired from somewhere no one can pinpoint. Someone with a rifle is hunting human beings in broad daylight. Fear spreads faster than the investigations can keep up. Police set up roadblocks. Helicopters circle overhead. Schools go into lockdown. Gas stations throw up makeshift tarps and temporary awnings so people can pump gas with at least the illusion of cover. Parents clutch their children's hands tighter in parking lots. Joggers start running in zigzag patterns as if erratic movement might throw off a sniper's aim. People crouch behind their car doors while filling up their tanks, eyes scanning rooftops and tree lines. Every open space becomes a potential kill zone. The randomness is the worst part. A landscaper mowing a median, a 13-year-old boy shot outside his school, a bus driver starting his morning route, an FBI analyst loading groceries into her car at a Home Depot. The victims span every age, race, and background. There's no pattern to exploit, no profile to avoid. Anyone could be next. That's how you hold an entire region hostage without ever issuing a formal threat. But the killers do leave messages. At one crime scene, investigators find a tarot card, the death card, with the words, "Call me God," scrawled across it. Notes demand money and taunt law enforcement, hinting at a wider plan. The media picks up every detail. Cable news runs wall-to-wall coverage. The terror is no longer local, it's national. Behind the chaos are two men, John Allen Muhammad, 41, and Lee Boyd Malvo, 17. On the surface, they don't fit the traditional profile of a serial killer duo. Muhammad is a Gulf War veteran with marksmanship training, or a man whose life has been defined by instability. Divorce, financial ruin, bitter custody battles. Malvo is a Jamaican teenager who drifted through broken family structures across multiple countries before latching onto Muhammad, who filled the role of father figure, mentor, and ideological groomer. Together they build a closed world where Muhammad's grievances, against his ex-wife, against the government, against society, become Malvo's reality. Muhammad frames their killing spree as part of a grand mission, a combination of revenge, extortion, and a delusional plan to eventually establish a compound in Canada where they'd raise other children in their warped image. To Malvo, still a kid desperate for belonging, Muhammad's vision becomes gospel. Their weapon is a Bushmaster 223 caliber rifle. Their platform is a 1990 blue Chevrolet Caprice, heavily modified into a mobile sniper's nest. From the outside, it looks like a beat-up sedan, the kind you see rusting in driveways all over America. But inside, Muhammad has turned it into something far more sinister. He cuts a small, concealed firing port near the license plate in the trunk. The back seat folds down. One of them can crawl into the trunk, set up the rifle on a makeshift rest, aim through that tiny opening, fire, and then close it back up. All while the car sits in a parking lot looking abandoned or innocuous. It's brilliant in the most horrifying way possible. They can kill from plain sight and vanish before anyone realizes where the shot came from. For days, they move through Maryland, Virginia, and D.C., selecting victims at random, taking their shots, and disappearing back into traffic. The task force grows. Federal agencies coordinate with local police. Profilers try to build a picture of who they're looking for. Tips flood in, thousands of them, but nothing sticks. The fear metastasizes. People stop going outside unless they have to. The region that houses the nation's capital feels like a war zone. The investigative break comes from an earlier, seemingly unrelated crime. In Montgomery, Alabama, months before the D.C. attacks, a shooting at a liquor store left a victim dead. A fingerprint recovered from a discarded magazine at that scene is run through databases and eventually matched to Lee Boyd Malvo. From Malvo, authorities trace connections to Muhammad, who owns a Bushmaster rifle similar to the murder weapon, and to a blue Chevy Caprice registered in his name. Law enforcement issues a region-wide bulletin for the car. The net tightens. On October 24, 2002, a truck driver at a rest stop near Myersville, Maryland, notices a blue Caprice that matches the description from news reports. He calls 911. In the early morning darkness, heavily armed officers surround the vehicle. When they move in, they find Muhammad and Malvo asleep inside. In the trunk, they find everything: the modified firing port, the Bushmaster rifle, a scope, maps marked with shooting locations, and other evidence tying the car and its occupants to the attacks. The legal strategy is straightforward. Virginia prosecutes first because its laws make the death penalty more likely. Muhammad is portrayed as the mastermind and primary shooter. Malvo as his teenage accomplice, indoctrinated and deeply under his influence. Muhammad is convicted and sentenced to death. He refuses to express remorse. On November 10, 2009, he's executed by lethal injection. Malvo's case is more complicated. He's 17 at the time of the crimes, legally a juvenile but involved in multiple killings. He receives multiple life without parole sentences in both Virginia and Maryland. Later Supreme Court decisions on juvenile sentencing force courts to revisit his punishment, raising questions that still don't have clean answers. How do you handle someone who was both victimized and weaponized? How much responsibility does a teenager bear when he's been groomed by a manipulative adult? Where does justice live in that gray space? A civil lawsuit against Bushmaster Firearms and Bullseye Shooter Supply, the dealer that sold Muhammad the rifle, raises another set of questions, and this time about corporate responsibility. Plaintiffs argue that negligent security and record-keeping allowed the gun to be diverted into criminal use. The case ends in a multi-million-dollar settlement, a rare financial consequence for the supply chain that armed a serial killer. For 3 weeks in October 2002, driving to school, pumping gas, or walking into a store in the D.C. suburbs felt like stepping onto a firing range. When the attacks ended, the fear lingered. Security cameras proliferated, interagency task forces became standard, the Beltway snipers redefined what random violence could look like, not a single act of madness, but a sustained campaign of hidden, calculated shootings that turned everyday life into a game of chance. For 3 weeks, the safest place in the DMV was inside your own head, and even that didn't feel safe enough. Quick question. What time is it where you are? Just curious how late some of you are staying up for this. Case 3. Hadden Clark. On the surface, Hadden Irving Clark was forgettable. A drifter who picked up handyman and gardening jobs, kept mostly to himself, and moved from one relative's couch to another. In suburban Maryland, he passed through backyards and side doors like any underpaid laborer trying to get by. Neighbors found him odd. He sometimes wore women's clothing, talked to himself, acted childlike in unsettling ways. But few imagined what he was capable of. He was just the guy who showed up to trim the hedges or fix a fence. Harmless, invisible. Clark's childhood offers a glimpse into the darkness that shaped him. He grew up in a profoundly dysfunctional family. An alcoholic mother who allegedly dressed him in girls' clothes and mocked him. A father who was abusive and emotionally absent. As an adult, Clark developed a complex swirl of mental illness, including paranoid schizophrenia, and what he described as alternate personalities. One of those he called Kristen, a female persona he blamed for his worst acts. Whether that was real dissociation or a convenient excuse, no one could say for sure. What mattered was what he did. The first confirmed tragedy tied to Clark occurred on May 31, 1986, in Silver Spring, Maryland. 6-year-old Michelle Dorr was playing outside near her father's home. It was an ordinary Saturday. Her father left her briefly to go inside and make sandwiches. When he returned, she was gone. Panic set in almost immediately. Police were called, neighbors searched, flyers went up on every telephone pole. Clark, who was staying at his brother's nearby house, had been seen in the area but wasn't an obvious suspect. Michelle's father, consumed with guilt and grief, even gave a confused, self-incriminating statement at one point, but investigators believed the evidence didn't support his involvement. The case went cold. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Michelle Dorr became another name on a list of missing children whose faces age artificially on posters that no one looks at anymore. What no one knew then was that Michelle had walked up to Clark's brother's house hoping to play with the children there. Clark answered the door. He lured her inside, up the stairs and into a bedroom. There he attacked her with a knife. The killing was brutal and swift. He buried her body miles away in a wooded area and went back to his life as if nothing had happened. By 1992, Clark had drifted into another affluent Maryland suburb, Bethesda near Chevy Chase, where he worked as a gardener and handyman for the Houteling family. Laura Houteling, 23, a recent Harvard graduate, had returned home while she figured out her next steps. Her mother, Penny, was fond of Clark at first, hiring him to tend the yard and handle odd jobs around the property. Over time, however, she began to suspect him of petty theft. Their relationship soured. Clark was told he was no longer needed. On an October day in 1992, Laura vanished. She was supposed to meet someone for a job appointment but never arrived. Her mother found her bed unmade but no sign of a struggle. At first, police considered the possibility that Laura had left voluntarily. Maybe she'd gotten overwhelmed, maybe she needed space. Then they noticed something strange. A neighbor reported seeing what looked like Laura leaving the house the morning she disappeared. But something about the gait, the shape, the way the person moved, it seemed off. That Laura had been Hadden Clark. He had murdered her, suffocated her with a pillow, then stabbed her, and wrapped her body in a sheet. He carried her into the woods half a mile away and buried her in a shallow grave. Then he returned to the house, put on one of Laura's outfits, added a wig and makeup, and walked out in broad daylight. The performance was designed to buy him time, to create the illusion that she'd walked out alive, and for a while, it worked. Crime scene technicians found blood in Laura's bedroom and a pillowcase with a fingerprint that matched Clark. Search warrants turned up women's clothing, wigs, and disturbing personal writings. Clark was arrested. Faced with mounting evidence, he eventually led investigators to Laura's grave. He was convicted of second-degree murder in her case and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Even behind bars, Clark couldn't or wouldn't stop talking. He told fellow inmates he'd killed before, that police had barely scratched the surface. One cellmate, a man with long hair and a beard, became a kind of confessor. Clark reportedly fixated on him as a Christ-like figure and confessed to killing another child years earlier. That confession reignited the old Michelle Dorr investigation. Acting on Clark's statements, police re-examined the Silver Spring house where Michelle had last been seen. Advanced forensic testing revealed traces of blood under floorboards that matched Michelle's DNA. In 2000, Clark, now in his late 40s, agreed to show investigators where he had buried her. But he had one condition. He insisted on doing so in women's clothing, a wig, skirt, and blouse, insisting that Kristen be present as he led them through wooded terrain to the remains of the long-missing 6-year-old. For Michelle's father, it confirmed the nightmare he'd lived with for 14 years. Clark was convicted of second-degree murder in Michelle's case as well, earning another 30-year sentence, plus time for related robbery offenses. He's serving a combined 60-year term in a Maryland prison. When investigators followed Clark's leads to his grandparents' former property on Cape Cod, they found something even more chilling. A plastic bucket buried on the land containing more than 200 pieces of jewelry and small personal items. Some were traced to known victims, like Laura's high school ring. Many could not be identified. Clark boasted that these were trophies from other killings: women, children, transients up and down the East Coast. To this day, those claims remain largely unverified. Some law enforcement officials suspect he's inflating his body count for attention, playing games to maintain relevance from behind bars. Others worry that, given his transient lifestyle and access to vulnerable people, there may indeed be unsolved cases tied to him that were never connected. The jewelry sits in evidence rooms, silent witnesses to crimes that may never be fully understood. The story of Hadden Clark sits at the intersection of severe mental illness, childhood trauma, and predatory violence. He was hiding in plain sight, tending lawns, fixing fences, making small talk with the very families whose children he watched. For Michelle Dorr and Laura Houteling, the danger wasn't a stranger in a dark alley. It was the odd man already inside their orbit, the gardener in the backyard. The drifter no one took seriously. He mowed your lawn. He smiled at your kids, and you never saw it coming. Case 4. Jason Billingsley. By the time Jason Dean Billingsley knocked on the basement apartment door on Edmondson Avenue in West Baltimore in September 2023, the state of Maryland had already decided twice that he was too dangerous to be free. He was a registered sex offender convicted in 2015 of a violent sexual assault that carried a 30-year sentence. But because of Maryland's diminution credit system, which allows inmates to shave years off their sentences through good behavior and work credits, Billingsley was released after serving about 9 years. Parole boards had denied him earlier, flagging him as high risk. The system still let him out. On the morning of September 19, 2023, he showed up at the basement unit where April Hurley lived with a friend. He told them he was maintenance staff, a claim that matched the kind of role he'd been able to get despite his record thanks to lax background checks by property managers. Hurley had no reason to see danger in the man at her door. Maintenance workers show up all the time. You let them in. You go about your day. The moment the door opened, Billingsley forced his way inside at gunpoint. What followed has been described in court as a nearly unspeakable sequence of acts: rape, torture, stabbing, and arson. Hurley had her throat slashed, was bound, and was set on fire along with her male friend. Neighbors, hearing the chaos and seeing smoke, pulled the victims out through a basement window. Both survived, but with life-altering injuries and trauma that no amount of surgery or therapy will ever fully erase. Billingsley vanished into the city. There was no immediate public warning that a violent offender who had just tried to burn 2 people alive was on the loose. No alert sent to residents, no press conference. 5 days of silence while he moved freely through Baltimore. 5 days later, on September 25, 2023, another name entered the story: Pava Lapere. 26 years old, a Forbes 30 under 30 honoree, she was the CEO of EcoMap Technologies, a fast-rising tech startup focused on mapping and improving local ecosystems and economies. She was, by any measure, a civic booster, someone trying to help the city she loved. She spoke at conferences, she mentored young entrepreneurs. She believed in Baltimore's future. Security footage from her Mount Vernon apartment building later reconstructed the final minutes of her life. Around 10:30 p.m., she entered the lobby, then let a man in, Billingsley. It's unclear whether he followed her, posed as a delivery person, or used some other ruse. They rode the elevator up together. 36 minutes later, he came down the stairs alone, wiping his hands on his shorts, having removed a sweatshirt he'd been wearing. When co-workers reported Lapere missing the next day, police found her body on the rooftop, beaten, strangled, and discarded in her own building. Now the alarm bells went off publicly. A man already wanted for a brutal assault and arson had allegedly killed a high-profile young tech leader while still on the street. The media erupted. The manhunt began in earnest. On September 27th, a SWAT team tracked Billingsley to a location in Bowie, Maryland, and arrested him without incident. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He was done. The community's anger quickly turned from Billingsley himself to the system that had allowed him to be in a position to offend again. Reporters dug into his record: the 2015 conviction, the 30-year sentence, the decision to suspend roughly half of it, the early release through administrative credits that prioritized prison capacity over public safety. Prosecutors and politicians publicly stated what people were thinking privately. He never should have been out. In August 2024, Billingsley pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Lapere's death and attempted murder and related charges for the Edmondson Avenue attack. In court, Hurley faced him and described how close she'd come to death and how every day since had been a struggle with fear, flashbacks, and the knowledge that her attacker had been handed to her by a system that didn't bother to check. Leper's parents spoke about their daughter's unrealized future, about birthdays and milestones that would never come, about a city that lost one of its brightest lights because bureaucracy valued efficiency over human life. The judge imposed 3 life terms, effectively ensuring that Billingsley will die in prison. Parallel to the criminal case, a civil reckoning played out. Hurley and her friend sued the property companies that had hired Billingsley as a maintenance worker without doing adequate background checks, arguing that their negligence directly put a violent sex offender in a position to access tenants' homes. A jury awarded them tens of millions of dollars in damages, a symbolic acknowledgement that corporate shortcuts can have catastrophic human costs. Politically, the case became the catalyst for the Pava Marie Leper Act, legislation eliminating diminution credits for people convicted of certain first-degree sexual offenses. In simple terms, it closed the exact loophole that had allowed Billingsley to leave prison decades early. Lawmakers framed it explicitly as a response to a preventable death and a systemic failure. The bill passed with bipartisan support, a rare moment of unity driven by collective horror. In the end, Jason Billingsley's story is not just about one predator. It's about the intersection of policy, bureaucracy, and human lives. What happens when a form-driven system of early release credits treats a violent offender as just another file to process, and how many people can be permanently scarred or killed before that mistake is corrected. It's about a maintenance man who should never have been anywhere near a tenant's door. It's about a young woman who let a stranger into her building because she had no reason to think the system had failed her so completely. Sometimes the most dangerous criminal isn't the one who broke in. It's the one the system let back out. If this story hit you hard, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. We're covering cases most channels won't touch, and your support keeps that going. Now let's keep moving. Case 5. Nicholas Browning. Cockeysville, Maryland is the sort of suburb people move to for the schools and the quiet, tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, neighbors who wave from their driveways. In early February 2008, the Browning family fit the image perfectly. John Browning was a respected attorney in Towson and a Boy Scout leader. Tamara was active in their church. Their sons, Nicholas 15, Gregory 13, and Benjamin 11, were known as polite, athletic, and academically solid. The kind of family you'd see at Sunday service or a Little League game and think, they've got it figured out. On paper, Nicholas was a success story. An honor student, varsity athlete, and Boy Scout. He built prayer gardens at his church as service projects. Adults who knew him saw a bright teenager with a good future. They did not see a boy quietly fantasizing about killing his entire family. On the night of February 1st, 2008, Nicholas was at a friend's house for a sleepover. Around midnight, he told his friends he needed to run home for a bit, that he'd grab his father's SUV so they could drive around. It sounded like normal teenage mischief, the kind of thing suburban kids do when they're bored and think they're invincible. Instead, Nicholas walked into something far darker. He entered his family's home through the basement door, which he'd arranged to be left unlocked earlier. In the basement workshop, he retrieved his father's 9mm handgun. Upstairs, his father was sleeping on the living room sofa. Nicholas stood over him, raised the gun, and fired into his head. John Browning never woke up. Nicholas then climbed the stairs. In the master bedroom, Tamara slept unaware. He shot her in the head. Down the hall, in separate bedrooms, 13-year-old Gregory and 11-year-old Benjamin lay in their beds. Nicholas went from room to room and executed his younger brothers one after the other. 4 members of the Browning family died in their sleep, never having a chance to scream, run, or understand what was happening. Nicholas tossed the gun into nearby bushes and returned to his friend's house. When they asked what took so long, he told them he'd fallen asleep in the car. The next day, he played the role of normal teenager, hanging out, gaming, acting as though nothing had happened. He laughed at jokes. He ate snacks. He was just Nick, the same as always. That evening, Nicholas and his friends went back to his house. He walked in ahead of them, then emerged moments later, discovering his father's body and acting horrified. He screamed. He stumbled. He called for help. Neighbors called 911. Police arrived to a scene that looked like a professional hit. 4 victims, all shot execution style in the head, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. At first, investigators considered the possibility of a targeted attack against John Browning given his work as an attorney, maybe a disgruntled client, maybe someone with a grudge. But as they interviewed Nicholas and his friends separately, cracks appeared. Timelines didn't match. Nicholas's demeanor swung rapidly from performative grief to cold detachment. He couldn't keep his story straight. When confronted more aggressively, Nicholas eventually broke and confessed. He described the killings in unsettling detail, down to the order of the rooms he entered and how he'd planned the route through the house. He said he'd been driven by years of what he called abuse from his father. Physical discipline, emotional cruelty, impossibly high expectations that made him feel trapped and worthless. The defense would later build on that claim, painting John as an alcoholic who drank heavily and could be verbally harsh, especially with his eldest son. They argued Nicholas had snapped under pressure, suffering from dissociative states that left him detached from his own actions. That in the moment he wasn't fully present, wasn't fully himself. It was trauma, they said. It was survival instinct misfiring. Prosecutors saw something else: entitlement and calculation. They introduced evidence that Nicholas had told classmates he was tired of his father telling him what to do, that he resented the idea of eventually splitting an inheritance 3 ways with his brothers. The state's mental health experts did not find a major psychiatric disorder that would excuse or explain the crimes as an episode of madness. What they found was a teenager who made a choice, planned it carefully, and executed it without hesitation. In January 2009, Nicholas pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder as part of a deal that took the death penalty off the table and avoided a trial that would have forced surviving relatives to relive the slaughter in agonizing detail. He was sentenced to 4 life terms, with 2 to be served consecutively. With credit and Maryland's parole rules, his earliest possible parole eligibility falls in the early 2030s, when he'll be approaching middle age. Years later, Nicholas petitioned for a sentence modification, pointing to U.S. Supreme Court rulings that limited life without parole sentences for juveniles. He argued that his age should weigh heavily, that he had been shaped by an abusive environment, that people can change. A judge listened and refused. The nature of the crime, the premeditation, and the complete eradication of his family outweighed any arguments for leniency. For the extended Browning family, the wounds never closed. Some relatives wrote letters begging the court not to soften his punishment, questioning how someone raised with love from at least part of the family could have decided that murder was a reasonable solution to anything. Others, including some who acknowledged John's flaws, pleaded for a chance at rehabilitation for Nicholas, insisting that a 15-year-old is never beyond redemption. The house in Cockeysville has changed hands more than once. At one point, another violent incident, unrelated to the Brownings, erupted on the same property, deepening its aura of bad luck or something worse. For neighbors, it's a physical reminder of a night when the monster in the story was not an intruder or a serial predator, but a boy they'd watched grow up. Nicholas Browning's case sits uncomfortably in the space between 2 truths: that children can be shaped by trauma, and that sometimes those children make choices so cold and final that no amount of empathy seems adequate to explain them away. He built prayer gardens at his church. Then he turned his home into a graveyard. Real talk. What's the weather like where you are? I need something normal in the comments after that story. Case 6. Jarrod Ramos, June 28, 2018. Late afternoon at the Capital Gazette in Annapolis. The small newsroom is in that familiar end-of-day crunch. Reporters filing stories, editors scanning copy, designers tweaking layouts for the next morning's edition. It's unglamorous work. Zoning battles, high school sports, city council dust-ups. But it's essential. Someone has to cover the things that matter to ordinary people living ordinary lives. The staff is small, tight-knit, experienced. They've been doing this for years, some for decades. Then the glass front doors explode inward. The man who steps through the shattered entrance is Jarrod Warren Ramos, 38 years old, carrying a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun and smoke grenades. He has come with a plan: block exits, sow confusion, and kill as many people as possible in the place he has fixated on for years. This is not random. This is personal. Ramos didn't randomly pick a newspaper. His rage had been simmering since 2011 when the Capital Gazette ran a short, factual story about his misdemeanor harassment conviction. He had stalked a former high school classmate. Phone calls, emails, social media messages that escalated from awkward to threatening. She went to court. She won a protective order. The paper covered it, as it routinely did with local criminal cases. The article was brief, accurate, and based entirely on court documents. It was the kind of story that runs in community newspapers every week without anyone giving it a second thought. For Ramos, that article became an obsession. He saw it as a public branding, a permanent stain on his name that ruined his reputation and his life. In 2012, he sued the paper and the reporter who wrote the story, claiming defamation. The courts dismissed the case, noting the story was accurate and protected by the First Amendment. Ramos appealed. The dismissal was upheld. Every legal avenue closed in his face. Most people at that point move on. Ramos did the opposite. He stewed. For years, he filed angry, rambling motions and posted venomous screeds about the paper online. He raged on social media. People who saw his digital footprint described it as obsessive and single-mindedly focused on the Capital Gazette. But like so many online fixations, it was hard to distinguish from the background noise of trolls and cranks. The newspaper staff was aware of him, had reported him to police at one point. But there was no clear legal mechanism to stop someone from being angry online. Free speech cuts both ways. On June 28th, that vague, simmering threat became horrifyingly concrete. Ramos had researched the newsroom layout. He knew the entrances and exits. He brought smoke grenades to disorient victims and slow down law enforcement. He wore dark clothing. He moved with purpose. He fired through the glass doors and stepped inside, moving through the maze of desks and cubicles, targeting anyone he saw. Within minutes, 5 people were dead. Wendy Winters, 65, a community reporter known for her warmth and for showing up to every charity event and local meeting with her notebook and a kind word. John McNamara, 56, a veteran sports and features writer who'd spent decades chronicling Maryland athletics with wit and precision. Gerald Fishman, 61, the quiet but razor-sharp editorial page editor whose editorials were measured, thoughtful, and unafraid. Rob Hyason, 59, an assistant editor and columnist known for his humor and humanity, and as the brother of novelist Carl Hyason. Rebecca Smith, 34, a sales assistant who had joined the paper not long before, full of energy and promise. Other staffers survived by hiding under desks, barricading themselves in corners, or playing dead among the fallen. Some texted loved ones as they waited, convinced they would not make it out. One reporter live-tweeted from under her desk, describing the sound of gunfire and the smell of smoke, her words becoming a real-time chronicle of terror that the world watched unfold. Ramos had tried to block a rear exit door to trap them inside. He moved methodically, firing and reloading, sweeping through the room. When police finally stormed the building minutes later, they found him hiding under a desk, blending in with the carnage he had created. He did not resist. He did not speak. His face was blank. The horror of that day didn't end with the shooting. Reporters from the Capital Gazette itself found themselves writing the first stories about their own colleagues' deaths, about their own trauma, about a massacre that had just happened in the room where they worked. One editor, Phil Davis, famously declared hours after the attack, "We're putting out a damn paper tomorrow." And they did. They worked that night from a makeshift location, producing an issue that left the editorial page intentionally blank, except for the names and faces of their 5 murdered colleagues. It was an act of defiance, grief, and professionalism that stunned the country. Legally, the case seemed straightforward, overwhelming evidence, no mystery about who did it. But Ramos's lawyers pursued a route that would stretch proceedings for years. He pleaded guilty to 23 counts, including 5 counts of first-degree murder, but then pleaded not criminally responsible, Maryland's version of an insanity defense. The trial that followed in 2021 pitted 2 narratives against each other. The defense argued that Ramos was consumed by delusions, that he'd lost touch with reality, that his obsessive focus on the paper was the product of severe mental illness that rendered him unable to understand the wrongfulness of his actions. The prosecution countered with evidence of detailed planning. The purchase of weapons months in advance, the study of building layouts, the barricading of exits, the selection of a time when the most people would be present, and Ramos's own statements afterward that showed he knew exactly what he'd done and why. Survivors testified, reliving the minutes they spent listening to shotgun blasts echoing through the office, waiting for a door to open or footsteps to stop near their hiding place. Families of the dead described birthdays and anniversaries that would forever be marked by absence, milestones that would never come, voices they would never hear again. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. They found Ramos criminally responsible. On September 28, 2021, a judge sentenced him to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional life term and hundreds more years for the attempted murders and related offenses. The structure of the sentence, life stacked on life, was symbolic, ensuring he would never leave prison regardless of future legal shifts or political wins. Ramos declined to address the court. There was no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the lives he'd destroyed. In Annapolis, the city created a physical reminder of what had happened and what it meant. The Guardians of the First Amendment Memorial features 5 towering stone pillars, 1 for each victim, and an engraving of the First Amendment, an assertion that the press, even when under literal fire, would not be silenced. Maryland designated June 28th as Freedom of the Press Day, in part to honor the courage of a newsroom that responded to mass murder by doing the one thing it knew how to do: keep publishing. The Capital Gazette later moved its operations to a new location. The old office, with its shattered glass and bullet-scarred walls, became a place of ghosts. The paper itself, like many local outlets, has struggled financially in the years since, but its reporters still cover the same city council meetings, the same local tragedies, the same human-scale stories that Ramos tried and failed to erase. They came to work to cover city council meetings. They left in body bags, and the next day they still published. Case 7. Kimberly Hricko, Valentine's Day, 1998. On Maryland's eastern shore, couples are checking into the Harbor Town Golf Resort near St. Michael's for a themed weekend. A live-action murder mystery complete with actors, costumes, and staged clues. It's supposed to be campy, romantic fun, champagne, cozy rooms, and a safe, fictional crime to solve before dessert. Guests are encouraged to dress up, play detective, and enjoy the irony of pretending someone's been killed while sipping wine by the fireplace. Among the guests are Kimberly Michelle Hricko, a surgical technician from Laurel, and her husband, Stephen Michael Hricko. To friends and co-workers, they look like a normal couple with a few marital rough edges. What no one yet knows is that Kimberly has already decided this is a one-way trip for Stephen. On paper, Kimberly's life feels constrained. A job in the operating room, a marriage that feels stagnant, mounting financial pressures. Outside that, she's been having an affair with a younger volunteer firefighter, and those around her would later testify that she seemed eager to leave her marriage, just not in a way that cost her money or lifestyle. Divorce is expensive, messy, inconvenient. She has a more permanent solution in mind. As a surgical tech, Kimberly has access to powerful drugs, including succinylcholine, a fast-acting paralytic used during surgeries to relax muscles and allow intubation. Succinylcholine shuts down muscle activity, including the diaphragm. A conscious person can suddenly find themselves unable to move or breathe, trapped inside their own body. It also metabolizes quickly, breaking down into compounds the body produces naturally, making it notoriously difficult to detect after death. For someone looking to commit the perfect murder, it's a near-ideal weapon. During the weekend festivities, Stephen drinks, eats, laughs, and enjoys the whodunit play unfolding around him, unaware that he's been cast in a parallel, all-too-real script. Back in the couple's room that night, prosecutors would later argue Kimberly administered succinylcholine, possibly by injection or slipped into a drink, while he was relaxed and vulnerable. Once the drug took hold, Stephen would have been paralyzed, then asphyxiated as his lungs simply stopped moving. He couldn't call for help. He couldn't fight back. He just stopped breathing. When he was dead or close to it, Kimberly set the room on fire. The story she told later was simple and plausible. Stephen had been drinking heavily, had a cigar, and must have fallen asleep with it still lit, igniting the fire. In that version, she was the shocked, grieving widow lucky to have escaped the blaze herself. She stumbled out into the hallway, screaming for help, playing the part of the devastated spouse. But the scene didn't line up. Fire investigators quickly ruled that the blaze had been deliberately set in a way inconsistent with an accident. The burn patterns were wrong. The origin points didn't match a dropped cigar. More importantly, the medical examiner found something odd in Stephen's body. No evidence of smoke inhalation. His lungs didn't show the carbon deposits and tissue damage they should have if he'd been alive and breathing during the fire. His blood alcohol level was relatively low. There was no carbon monoxide in his system. He appeared to have been dead, or at least not breathing, before the flames took hold. Toxicology couldn't capture succinylcholine directly. The drug breaks down too fast for standard tests to detect. But once other causes of death were excluded and given Kimberly's professional access to the drug, the prosecution built a circumstantial but compelling case around it. They also uncovered proof of Kimberly's infidelity, her discontent with the marriage, and crucially, substantial life insurance policies on Stephen, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Motive, means, and opportunity lined up neatly. Co-workers and acquaintances testified that Kimberly had spoken about wanting Stephen gone, had joked darkly about methods, and had even floated the idea of hiring someone to do it. What had once sounded like venting now sounded like premeditation. The state's theory was chilling. She used an operating room drug to quietly paralyze and kill her husband, then tried to burn his body in the room to simulate an accidental death and secure a massive insurance payout. The fact that they were attending a murder mystery weekend at the time only added a grotesque layer of irony. In 1999, Kimberly went to trial. The defense argued that there was no direct proof she had obtained or administered succinylcholine, that everything about the drug was an inference, speculation built on circumstantial evidence. They attacked the fire science, suggested alternate medical explanations, and painted Kimberly as a woman trapped in a difficult marriage, not a cold-blooded killer. The jury disagreed. She was convicted of first-degree murder and first-degree arson and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. Appeals later challenged the sufficiency of the medical evidence and the inference about succinylcholine, but courts upheld the conviction. She remains incarcerated at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women. The case later became the subject of a Forensic Files episode which drilled into the forensic puzzle. How do you prove a murder when the murder weapon is an invisible chemical that disappears inside a burned room? The answer here lay in what wasn't present: smoke in the lungs, carbon monoxide in the blood, and in the human context, the affair, the money, the prior comments, the convenient timing. For Stephen's family, the cruelty is almost unbearable in its intimacy. He checked into a resort with his wife for a themed weekend where a pretend murder would be solved by dessert. He never made it home. He was killed by the one person in the room who knew exactly how to stop a human heart and make it look like an accident. He thought he was solving a fake murder. He had no idea he was the victim in a real one. Look, I know these stories are heavy, but they matter. If you think someone else should hear them, share this video and drop a comment. I read every single one. Case 8. Catherine Hoggle, September 7, 2014, Montgomery County, Maryland. Troy Turner drops his two youngest children, Sarah, 3 years old, and Jacob, 2, off with their mother, Catherine Hoggle, for what should be a short, ordinary visit. Catherine tells him she's taking them out for pizza. He kisses them goodbye, expecting them back later that evening. They never come home. At first, Troy assumes there's been a miscommunication, maybe a last-minute change of plans. But when hours pass with no word from Catherine, concern sharpens into panic. He calls. No answer. He drives to the places she frequents. Nothing. He files a missing persons report. Police issue alerts. Begin canvassing the area. Pull security footage from restaurants and gas stations. When they finally track Catherine down the next day, she doesn't have the children with her. She's confused, agitated, incoherent. Her explanations shift from moment to moment. First, she says she dropped the kids off with a friend, then with a babysitter. Later, she can't remember where. She offers names that don't exist and addresses that lead nowhere. When pressed, she becomes more disoriented, circling back to fragments of earlier statements or lapsing into silence. The story makes no sense because Catherine Hoggle is not operating in consensus reality. She has been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and has a documented history of severe mental illness. In the months leading up to the children's disappearance, her condition had deteriorated. She'd stopped taking medication. She'd become increasingly paranoid, talking about conspiracies, expressing delusions about people trying to harm her or take the children. Troy, who had been trying to support her while also protecting the kids, knew she was unwell. But he never imagined she was capable of making them disappear. Massive searches begin. Volunteers comb wooded areas, parks, and waterways. Divers check the Potomac River. K-9 units sweep Montgomery County. Helicopters scan from above. Detectives interview neighbors, relatives, acquaintances, anyone who might have seen Catherine or the children on September 7th or in the days leading up to it. Weeks turn into months. No bodies are found. No witnesses come forward with credible sightings. Sarah and Jacob Hoggle simply vanish. Without remains or direct physical evidence, the state builds a case on behavior and circumstantial clues. Catherine is arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with kidnapping and parental abduction charges. Prosecutors argue that she killed the children, whether through deliberate violence, neglect, or some act driven by her delusions, and then concealed their bodies in a way that has kept them hidden for years. The defense does not dispute that the children are gone. What they dispute is whether Catherine Hoggle is mentally competent to stand trial, whether she understands the charges against her, can assist in her defense, or even grasps the basic structure of a courtroom proceeding. For the next decade, the case becomes a legal and ethical labyrinth. Catherine is committed to Clifton T. Perkins Hospital Center, a maximum security psychiatric facility where doctors attempt to restore her competency through medication, therapy, and structured treatment. The law requires that a defendant be mentally present enough to participate meaningfully in their own defense. If they're not, the trial cannot proceed. But Maryland also has a 5-year rule. If someone charged with a crime remains incompetent for 5 years, the criminal case must be dismissed unless there's a finding of progress toward competency. Year after year, court-ordered evaluations come back the same, not competent. Catherine remains trapped in a fog of paranoia and cognitive fragmentation. At hearings, she appears detached, sometimes babbling, sometimes silent. Experts testify that she does not understand what a trial is, cannot identify the role of a prosecutor or a judge, and cannot form a rational relationship with her attorneys. Troy Turner sits through every hearing advocating, grieving, demanding justice for children whose bodies have never been found. He has no grave sites to visit, no remains to bury. He lives in a purgatory where his kids are legally presumed dead but never confirmed dead, where the person who knows what happened is legally unreachable. In September 2022, after nearly 8 years of psychiatric hospitalization and dozens of competency evaluations, a judge makes the inevitable ruling. Catherine Hoggle will never be competent to stand trial. The murder charges are dismissed. Prosecutors, visibly frustrated, argue that this outcome is a failure of the system, a loophole that allows someone to escape accountability by being too mentally ill to prosecute. But the law is the law, and constitutional protections for the accused cannot be suspended even in cases this heartbreaking. Catherine is not released. She remains civilly committed to Perkins Hospital as a danger to herself and others, meaning she could theoretically stay institutionalized indefinitely. But she will never face a jury. She will never be convicted. She will never be sentenced for murder. The case leaves behind more questions than answers. Did Catherine, in a psychotic episode, kill her children and hide their bodies in a location no one has found? Did she, in a delusional state, hand them off to strangers she believed were protecting them from imagined threats? Did something else happen? An accident, a moment of neglect that spiraled out of control that she can no longer remember or articulate? Some believe she's genuinely lost in her mind, that whatever memories she has of that day are buried under layers of illness. Others suspect she's more aware than she lets on, that her incompetence is strategic, a performance that has successfully shielded her from trial. Psychiatrists remain divided. The courts, bound by due process, have reached the only conclusion they could under the law. Troy Turner continues to search. He has not given up on finding Sarah and Jacob, even as hope fades with each passing year. He has become an advocate for changing Maryland's competency laws, arguing that cases like this, where a defendant remains indefinitely incompetent, need a different legal framework that doesn't leave victims' families in permanent limbo. For now, Catherine Hoggle sits in a psychiatric hospital, and 2 children remain ghosts. Their names are on missing posters that have long since faded. Their faces appear in databases that generate fewer and fewer leads. No bodies, no closure, no trial, no conviction. 2 children vanished. The only person who knows what happened can't or won't say. And the law has run out of answers. Honest question, how are you holding up? This one messes with people. Let me know in the comments. Case 9. Joseph Palczynski. By March 2000, Joseph Charles Palczynski had already proven, repeatedly, that he was dangerous. Court records painted a clear picture. Domestic violence, assault, stalking, weapons charges. He had restraining orders stacked against him like parking tickets. He had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder but rarely stayed on medication. He cycled in and out of the system, arrested, released, arrested again, each time walking away before the consequences caught up with his escalating behavior. Police knew his name. Ex-girlfriends knew to stay away. The system knew he was a ticking bomb. And yet, he kept slipping through. Palczynski had fixated on Tracy Whitehead, a young woman he dated briefly and then terrorized for months. She'd left him. She'd filed for a protective order. She'd done everything the system tells victims to do. But protective orders are just paper, and Palczynski didn't care about paper. He cared about control. When Tracy moved on and started seeing someone else, his obsession turned lethal. On the evening of March 7, 2000, Palczynski showed up at the Bowley's quarters home of Tracy's new boyfriend, carrying a .38 caliber handgun. Inside were 4 people: the boyfriend, his mother, his stepfather, and Tracy herself. Palczynski forced his way in and opened fire. He killed the boyfriend's mother, stepfather, and shot the boyfriend multiple times, leaving him critically wounded but alive. Then he grabbed Tracy at gunpoint and dragged her out of the house. He disappeared into the night, starting a multi-state manhunt that would dominate headlines for the next 10 days. Palczynski wasn't just running. He was moving with purpose, crossing state lines, stealing cars, making cryptic phone calls to relatives and ex-girlfriends, taunting investigators. Tracy, held at gunpoint and constantly on the move, lived in a state of sustained terror, unsure whether each hour would be her last. Palczynski was armed, paranoid, and desperate, a combination that made negotiation nearly impossible. On March 17th, the chase ended in Dundalk, a blue-collar neighborhood in Baltimore County. Palczynski forced his way into a small row house where a mother and her 3 young children lived, a woman he knew tangentially from his past. He took all 5 people inside, Tracy, the mother, and her 3 kids, hostage, and barricaded the doors. He had weapons. He had ammunition. And he made it clear he wasn't coming out peacefully. What followed was 97 hours of high-stakes psychological warfare broadcast live on local and national television. Police surrounded the house. SWAT teams set up perimeters. Snipers took positions on rooftops. Negotiators established phone contact and tried to talk him down. But Palczynski was erratic, sometimes lucid, sometimes manic, veering between rage and self-pity. He demanded to speak with his mother. He ranted about betrayal. He swung between threatening the hostages and insisting he would never hurt them. No one inside or outside the house knew which version of him would show up from one hour to the next. The neighborhood was evacuated. Families grabbed what they could and left, watching from motels and relatives' homes as news helicopters circled their street and armored vehicles blocked intersections. Schools nearby went into lockdown. For 4 days, Dundalk felt like a war zone. Inside the house, the hostages, especially Tracy and the mother, worked to keep Palczynski calm. They fed him. They talked to him. They played along with his delusions and tried to make him believe they weren't afraid, even as every second stretched with the possibility of sudden violence. Tracy, who had spent 10 days as his captive already, knew his triggers, knew when to speak and when to stay silent. She became both victim and negotiator, managing a man whose moods could flip in an instant. On the 3rd day, the hostages convinced Palczynski to take sedatives to help him sleep, medication provided through negotiators under the guise of calming his nerves. He took them, And as the drugs began to take hold, the hostages saw a narrow window. They moved carefully, quietly. Over the next several hours, they slipped out. First the children, then the mother, then Tracy. One by one, they escaped through a back door while Palczynski dozed or drifted in a drugged haze. By the time police realized all the hostages were out, the calculation changed. There was no longer a need for restraint. The only person left inside was a triple murder suspect who had terrorized a region for nearly 2 weeks. On March 21, 2000, after 97 hours, tactical officers moved in. Palczynski, disoriented and realizing he'd been left alone, stumbled toward the front door. Some reports say he was armed, others suggest he appeared confused. What's certain is that officers, unwilling to risk another escape or shootout, opened fire the moment he emerged onto the front lawn. 27 rounds hit him. He died on the grass in front of the house, in full view of cameras that had been trained on the scene for days. The standoff was over. In the aftermath, investigators and advocates dissected how Joseph Palczynski had been allowed to remain free despite his documented history of violence, mental illness, and weapons charges. There were gaps at every level. Judges who set low bail, prosecutors who accepted plea deals, a mental health system that couldn't compel treatment, and a protective order framework that offered no real protection when someone decided to ignore it. Restraining orders had been filed, warnings had been issued, red flags had been waved. And still Palczynski had walked out of courtrooms and continued his rampage until he killed 3 people and held 5 more hostage for 4 days. Tracy Whitehead survived, but survival came with permanent scars. She later became an advocate for domestic violence victims, speaking publicly about the systemic failures that allowed her abuser to nearly kill her and successfully kill others. She has pushed for stronger enforcement of protective orders, better coordination between law enforcement and mental health services, and a legal framework that treats patterns of escalating violence as the emergencies they are. The house in Dundalk became a grim landmark. Neighbors who returned after the evacuation couldn't shake the memory of helicopters overhead and armed officers in their yards. Some moved away. Others stayed but rarely spoke about those 4 days in March when their street became the center of a nightmare that the entire region watched unfold in real time. Joseph Palczynski's story is a case study in systemic failure. Every institution that touched him, law enforcement, the courts, mental health services, knew he was dangerous, and every institution, for different reasons, let him go. By the time the system finally stopped him, 3 people were dead, and a neighborhood had been held hostage on live television. 4 days, 1 neighborhood. And a man the system should never have let walk free. Case 10. Adnan Syed and Hai Min Lee, January 13, 1999, Woodlawn High School, Baltimore County. Hai Min Lee, an 18-year-old senior, leaves campus in the early afternoon to pick up her young cousin from daycare. A routine she's followed for months. She never arrives. Her family reports her missing that evening. Friends pass around flyers. Police begin piecing together her last known movements. On February 9th, her body is found in Leakin Park, a sprawling wooded area in West Baltimore with a grim reputation as a dumping ground. She's been manually strangled and partially buried in a shallow grave. The medical examiner estimates she'd been dead for weeks, likely killed on or near the day she disappeared. Investigators quickly zero in on Adnan Syed, Hai's ex-boyfriend. They had dated for several months before breaking up in late 1998. Friends described the relationship as intense but ultimately strained. Normal high school drama magnified by the secrecy both kept from their immigrant families. Hai had started seeing someone new. Some acquaintances report that Adnan seemed hurt but not violent. Others recall subtle signs of possessiveness. The police see a classic motive: jealousy, rejection, rage. The case against Adnan hinges largely on the testimony of Jay Wilds, a friend and occasional marijuana dealer who tells police that Adnan confessed to killing Hai and asked for help burying her body. Jay's story shifts across multiple police interviews. Details about timing, locations, and his own involvement change with each retelling. But the core narrative remains consistent. Adnan killed Hai, called Jay for help, and together they drove to Leakin Park and buried her. Supporting Jay's account is cell phone tower data. Prosecutors argue that pings from Adnan's phone place him near Leakin Park the evening of the murder, corroborating Jay's timeline. What the jury doesn't hear is the disclaimer that AT&T included on those records, stating that incoming call location data is not considered reliable for determining position. That detail won't surface publicly until years later. Another critical piece of information never makes it to trial. Asia McLean, a classmate, tells Adnan's defense team she saw him in the Woodlawn Public Library at the exact time prosecutors claim he was killing Hai. It's a potential alibi that could have shifted the entire case. But Adnan's original defense attorney, Cristina Gutierrez, never calls Asia to the stand. Whether it was strategic miscalculation, oversight, or incompetence, the decision leaves a gaping hole in his defense. In 2000, Adnan Syed is convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. He's sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. He maintains his innocence. Appeals are filed and denied. The case fades from public view, becoming just another tragic entry in Baltimore's long catalog of violent crime. Then in 2014, everything changes. Serial, a podcast hosted by journalist Sarah Koenig, dedicates its entire first season to re-examining Adnan's case. Over 12 episodes, Koenig dissects the evidence, interviews key players, explores inconsistencies in Jay's testimony, scrutinizes the cell tower data, and raises uncomfortable questions about whether the jury got it right. The podcast becomes a cultural phenomenon. Millions of downloads, water cooler debates, think pieces, and true crime obsession on a scale never seen before. Public opinion fractures. Some listeners are convinced Adnan was wrongly convicted based on circumstantial evidence and prosecutorial overreach. Others believe he's guilty, and that the podcast romanticizes a murderer. Haya's family, largely absent from the podcast's narrative, releases statements expressing pain at having their daughter's death turned into entertainment, and their grief reopened for public consumption. The legal aftermath is a dizzying roller coaster. In 2016, a judge vacates Adnan's conviction, citing ineffective assistance of counsel for failing to contact Asia McLean. The state appeals. In 2018, Maryland's Court of Special Appeals reinstates the conviction. More appeals follow. The case ping-pongs through the system, each ruling generating fresh headlines and reigniting debates. In September 2022, prosecutors in Baltimore file a motion to vacate Adnan's conviction, citing newly uncovered evidence, alternative suspects who were never properly investigated, and problems with the reliability of the cell tower evidence. A judge grants the motion. After 23 years in prison, Adnan Syed walks free. Charges are dropped. For many, it feels like vindication. For Hai's family, it feels like betrayal. But the story doesn't end there. In 2023, an appellate court reinstates Adnan's conviction on procedural grounds, ruling that Hayes' family was not given proper notice or an opportunity to attend the hearing where his conviction was vacated, a violation of Maryland's victims' rights laws. The decision doesn't address his guilt or innocence. It's purely about process. The conviction is back, but he remains free while the state decides whether to retry him. In 2025, under Maryland's Juvenile Restoration Act, a law allowing those sentenced as juveniles to seek sentence reductions after serving significant time, Adnan's sentence is formally modified. He is released with credit for time served. The state declines to pursue a new trial. Practically speaking, he is a free man. Legally speaking, the case remains a tangle of unanswered questions. Min Lee's family has been vocal throughout the process, expressing frustration that their daughter's murder has been eclipsed by debates over Adnan's guilt, that her humanity has been reduced to a plot point in a podcast, and that the legal system has failed to give them closure. They believe Adnan is guilty. They believe justice was done in 2000. They believe everything since has been a media-driven miscarriage. Others argue that the system convicted a teenager on questionable evidence, and the testimony of an unreliable witness, that tunnel vision prevented police from exploring other leads, and that Adnan lost decades of his life to a conviction built on sand. So where does that leave us? Min Lee is still dead. Adnan Syed is free. And after 26 years, no one can agree on what justice looks like. 10 cases, 10 different faces of violence. From Ocean City to Annapolis, from suburban Cockeysville to the streets of West Baltimore, Maryland has hosted a catalog of crimes that defy easy explanation. You've heard about couples who turned vacations into nightmares, snipers who paralyzed a region, a gardener who hid bodies under flower beds, and a system that opened the door for a killer it had already locked up. You've seen how evil hides in plain sight, in a Boy Scout, a scrapbooker, a maintenance man, a teenager with a grudge. But these stories aren't just about the criminals. They're about the people who didn't come home. Min Lee, who was supposed to pick up her cousin, Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley, who thought they'd made vacation friends. Pavala Perry, who was building a future for her city. Wendy Winters, John McNamara, Gerald Fishman, Rob Hiace, and Rebecca Smith. Journalists who showed up to work and never left. They were real. They had plans. They had people who loved them. These stories also live on in the survivors, the families, the policy changes that followed, and the quiet caution people now carry when they pump gas, hire a contractor, or let a stranger through the door. Some of these cases ended with clean convictions. Others remain legal and emotional question marks. Some exposed system failures so glaring that laws were rewritten. Others remind us that no law can stop someone determined to destroy. Maryland still sells the same dream: crabs by the bay, historic charm, quiet suburbs where kids ride bikes and parents grill on weekends. But woven into that dream are stories like these, reminders that darkness doesn't announce itself. It walks in through unlocked doors, smiles from behind a desk, or sits in a car you'd never look at twice. These stories don't end when the trial does. They live on in families, in policy changes, in the quiet caution people carry when they meet a stranger on vacation or hire someone to mow their lawn. If you made it this far, you're the real one. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and check out our previous video on unsolved cases that still haunt investigators. It's just as intense. And seriously, drop a comment. What case hit you hardest? I want to know. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there.